Hi, my name is Todd Uglow, and I'm a Career Resources Specialist here at Missouri State University. Today, we are going to talk about how you can create a resume for success. Today, we're going to cover your resume formatting, so how your resume should look, and we're also going to talk about the content of your resume, or what should be included, as well as how you should include it. We'll finish off by talking a bit about some of the services that we offer to alumni and students here at Missouri State University. So when we think about your resume, what I want to really get you in the mindset of is looking at your resume as your marketing toolkit. Essentially, the purpose of your resume isn't necessarily there to get you the job, it's there to help you with an opportunity to meet with that employer face to face. And so most of us are very familiar with what the purpose of a billboard is, right? Essentially, a billboard's job is to entice somebody to want to buy or engage in a service or product. Essentially, you should look at your resume in the same light. Really, the point of the resume is to help the employer to learn just enough about you to want to bring you in for a face-to-face conversation, aka an interview. So first, we're going to start off by talking about how your resume should look. Now, formatting is sometimes going to vary depending on your professional career path or goals that you have for yourself. And I'll touch on that just a little bit in some of our points that we discuss on this slide here. But there are a few things that no matter what field you're planning to go into or what your career path is going to look like that you should consider when it comes to the appearance of your resume. The first thing that we want to consider are your fonts and asking yourself, are your fonts professional? What we mean by professional fonts are things that are not going to distract the reader from the content of your resume. And so obviously we know that we should avoid things like Comic Sans or wingdings, right? But we also should consider avoiding things that are very challenging or difficult for somebody to read. And so some of the fonts that we may want to consider sticking to would be things like Times New Roman, Century Gothic, Garamond, Veranda. Those are just a few. Now there's a lot of different fonts that you could use out there. Also there's Arial and those types of fonts that we see a lot with our other documentation. But think about going outside the box just a little bit and maybe using a font style that a lot of other people don't use. At the end of the day, as long as it's professional, is really what counts. And it's easy to read, of course. The other thing that you want to consider is whether or not you are maximizing the space that you have. So essentially, when you look at your resume, you have 8.5 by 11 inches to tell your story, okay? Now, a lot of times people will tell you that a 2-page resume is completely off the table and should not even be considered. A 2-page resume can be beneficial in certain circumstances, and some career fields actually are okay with a 2-page resume. Sometimes in the healthcare or the education career fields, 2-page resumes are typically a bit more common. But for most business career fields or some others, 1 page is usually going to be enough. What I usually recommend is thinking about how much experience you have and how much that would relate to a page length on a resume. So usually for every 5 years of experience, and this is professional full-time experience, you can warrant another page of your resume. So for most college students who don't have a lot of years of experience, a 1-page resume is going to be where you would probably want to stay. Now, another reason why 2-page resumes can be challenging is because on average, an employer is going to spend about 12 to 15 seconds looking at your document. If you have really great content on a 2nd page of a resume, there's a chance that an employer may never even see that information, which could be detrimental to your opportunity to be considered for an interview. And so 1 page is going to be typically standard, but sometime later in your career, or if you're going to a career field where 2-page resumes are more common, you may be able to have a 2nd page with your resume. Something else that you want to consider when it comes to the formatting of your resume is whether or not it's easy for a reader to tell where one job or section starts and the other one ends. On our Career Center homepage, we have several examples of ways and strategies for making sure that you are using appropriate section headers with bolds and italics and underlines, so that way it's easy for an employer to tell where a job starts and where it ends. Like I said before, they're only going to spend about 12 to 15 seconds looking at your document. So if they can't tell where one of your jobs starts and the other one ends, or even where one section starts or ends, they're probably not going to take the time to dig through your resume to find the content that they're looking for. Another aspect you'd want to consider is the consistency of your document. So what we mean by consistency is, are you using the same styles and formatting, etc., throughout your document? So an example of this would be the use of italics. If you decide to use italics for one date on your resume, it's really important to make sure that you use italics for your entire document. The reason being is because a lot of times employers use your ability to present a consistent document as a tool to determine if you are going to be somebody who pays really strong attention to detail and is going to be able to create professional documents in their workplace. And so it's really important to make sure that everything is consistent on your resume. So another aspect is the professionalism of your document. That goes along with some of your formatting and font styles that you use, but professionalism is key. So again, sometimes if we want to get really creative with our documents, that can take away from that professionalism, which leads me into my next point. A lot of times, just like with the 2-page resume, you may hear advice that says creativity in your resume is not okay. Creativity can be fine as long as it's for the appropriate industry or the job. Now, you really have to know the industry or the job you're applying to determine whether or not creativity is going to be something that's acceptable. So like I said, doing your research on this, whether it's talking to somebody in your department, a faculty member or an advisor, or speaking with somebody in the Career Center to help get a better idea of what's going to be appropriate for your industry. So the blanket rule of creativity is never okay is definitely not the case. Creativity can be beneficial for the right career and the right job. Again, readability should always take precedence over anything when it comes to creating your resume. This is something that will make sure that the employer is actually going to take the time to read your document. So a few things with that you'd want to consider is your font sizes. I would recommend never going smaller than 11-point font on your resume. The reason being, it's because people who may have difficulty reading small font are not, and if your resume is 11-point font, may not take that time to really look at your document because it's going to be too challenging for them to read. You also don't want to go too large with your font size, so I recommend not necessarily going larger than 12-point. Sometimes you can use a 14-point font when it comes to your headers on your sections, but most of the time keeping it between 11 to 12-point font is going to be ideal. You should also consider how small your margins are. You typically do not want to go smaller than 0.7 inches on your margins. So the reason for that being is because some printers, if you go smaller than 0.7, will actually cut off some of that content. And obviously, if an employer prints off your document and it cuts off some of that content, that will not bode well for your candidacy for that job. So again, making sure that your document is readable. If you're unsure about that, it's important to have somebody else take a look at it for you to give you that honest feedback about whether or not your document is readable. So next we're going to talk about the content of your resume. So what you should include and how you should include it. One of the age-old questions when it comes to content of a resume is, what are employers really looking for? Now that can be a silly question because obviously it's difficult for us to call an employer up, of a job that we're interested in and ask them, hey, what do you want me to put on your resume? I definitely wouldn't recommend doing that. But there are some ways that you can learn about anecdotally about what employers might be looking for. Obviously, knowing the industry that you're planning to go into or that you're applying for a job in is super important, and that's something in the Career Center that we can help you do. Obviously, speaking with your advisors or your faculty members can assist you with that. Doing some research on the employer as well as the industry specifically can also be very helpful in helping you to get a better understanding of what employers are really looking for. Another good tool to help you with understanding what an employer might be looking for a particular job is using that job posting. Anytime an employer is hiring for a job, they're usually going to put a job posting out there that tells potential candidates what they're looking for. That's essentially your cheat sheet, letting you know what are the skills, experiences, etc. that an employer wants to see on your document. So to help you get a better understanding of what employers might be looking for, I always like to show students and alumni a list of the most marketable attributes according to employers. This list was put together by the National Association of Colleges and Employers in 2019. Essentially what they did is they surveyed employers from all different industries, both in the United States and outside of the United States, asking them what are the skills that they value most when considering applicants for both full-time, internship, and part-time opportunities with their organization. As you can see from this list, these are probably a lot of things that you already have experience with. Whenever I'm talking with students about their marketable skills, I always encourage them to think outside the box. Marketable skills do not have to come just from a paid experience that you had. So when we talk about marketable attributes, it's important to look outside of traditional jobs that we may or may not have had, because some of us may not have had the opportunity to work in a paid job. And so it's important to look at what other experiences have you had. Have you gained some of these skills in a student organization? Have you gained some of these skills through a volunteer activity? Maybe you gained some of these skills through a major class project that you've done. At the end of the day, really just thinking more critically and thinking broader and outside the box of all the experiences you've had and the things that you've gained from those experiences. A lot of times I'll have students who I work with in my office who will say, well, I've only worked in retail or I've only worked in food service. Most of you know who have worked in retail or food service that it takes a lot of skills to be successful in that type of job, right? So you have to be able to communicate. You have to be able to engage in problem solving skills. You obviously have to work in a team. So those are just a few things that you could build off of and make that connection back to a potential job that you might be interested in. In a lot of instances, and employers are going to be looking more so for transferable skills, like some of the things that I have mentioned on this page here, more so than trying to hire somebody who has the most degrees or the most experiences directly related to that position. If you can demonstrate that you have these transferable skills on your resume and in an interview, that sometimes is more than enough for an employer to take the risk in hiring you for whatever position it is that they have available. So my challenge to you would be to think about all the experiences you've had, not just paid jobs, and how might you have developed some of these skills that are listed on this page here. So something else to consider is engaging in that brainstorming type of approach. So anytime we write a paper, right, or do a research project for a class, we usually engage in some form of brainstorming. The same is true when it comes to writing your resume. Most people, when they sit down and write a resume, they'll just sit down at a computer and just start typing away. What we know is that sometimes that's not always the most effective way to get things done, right? And so one activity that I would encourage the students that I work with to engage in would be to taking some time to think about those things that you've accomplished or those experiences that you've had or those skills that you've developed and qualities, as well as what you've learned through your studies here at Missouri State or in other institutions that you might have attended. And so when a student sometimes comes into my office and we're working on a resume, I will actually have them go through this process. And so I would even challenge you to engage in this activity to kind of help you think broader and develop more content that you could potentially include on your resume. So what we have here in these 4 quadrants are education, experience, skills, and qualities. And so again, just like before, thinking outside the box of the skills that you gain and the experiences, etc., I would challenge you to make this quadrant and jot down some of those things that you think apply to you as it relates to your experiences, your qualities, your skills, and those types of things that are going to be marketable to an employer for a potential job that you're interested in applying to. So the next 3 slides are going to be primarily focused on 3 sections that every resume should have. No matter what your major is, what career path you plan to go down, there are always 3 sections that no matter what, you should include on your resume. The first one that we have here is contact information. Now that might seem pretty obvious, But a lot of times when I include something in a presentation, it's because I've seen enough of those mistakes in my office to make sure, to warrant me to want to make sure that people understand what's expected with this piece of information on your resume. So when it comes to your contact information, first and foremost, having your first and last name on that document. Now, a lot of times people will ask, is it okay for me to use a nickname, or is it okay for you to use my middle name? On a resume, that's okay for you to do, but I would encourage you that anytime you fill out an online application, or if you're using any other type of legal documentation, you use your name that's assigned to you legally. The reason for this being is because sometimes employers may use that to run it through like a background check or something along those lines, and because it's a legally binding document, you want to make sure that you're using your legal first and last name on your resume. The second piece of information that you'd want to make sure to include would be your address. So on a lot of resumes, you may see people using multiple addresses. My advice would be to only use one, and the one you use will be determined based off of your circumstance at the time. So for example, if you live in Springfield currently and go to school, but you are applying for an internship back home in Kansas City where you might be from, it might be good to include your Kansas City address. The reason being is because that could show an employer that you have residency in that city, you know the city, and so sometimes that can help give you a little bit of a leg up when you're interviewing or applying for that job. Same goes for if you're currently living in Springfield and you're applying for a job in Springfield, it might be good to use your temporary address or your address that you have here in town. Now, address on a resume has become somewhat of a information that's maybe not as important as it once was. The reason being is because obviously we mostly communicate via telephone and email now, and so address has become something that's not really as important as it once was. And so honestly, if you choose not to include your address, that's okay too. Obviously, if you are applying for a job, say in Dallas, Texas, and you currently live in Springfield and you're from Kansas City, well, you don't have any residency in Dallas. You don't really have a lot of connections in Dallas. So having your address on there probably wouldn't really be that important. If anything, it might free you up a few more lines to include some additional content on your resume. Third thing that you want to make sure you include on your resume is obviously your phone number. Now, with your phone number, it's really important to ensure that you have a voicemail, and your voicemail box needs to be set up, and you need to have a professional greeting. So if you are somebody who has one of those voicemails that pretends they're answering the phone whenever somebody calls you, I would recommend highly that you change that as soon as possible. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to have a recorded message, because if you're like me, you'll record it 16 times before you're okay with it. What you could do is just record your name, because most voicemails give you that option, so at least the employer knows that they reached the right person. Okay. And with your voicemail, it's always important to make sure, again, that your voicemail box is set up. No employer wants to call somebody for an interview and get that message that says this voicemail box is not set up. That's a really quick way to remove you out of the potential consideration for that job. The other thing when it comes to your voicemail is to make sure that you're checking it regularly. If this isn't something that you're in the habit of doing, please make sure you do that. And I would check it on a daily basis, especially if you're currently in the job search process. Finally, with your contact information, it's important to make sure that you include an email address. And by email address, I really do mean a professional email address. So a lot of us were probably guilty of, in junior high, creating, or middle school, creating one of those emails that maybe were fun at the time, but not so professional now. Think, basketball for life, or groovy soccer gal, or anything along those lines. So you want to make sure that you're using a more professional email address. Using your university account is okay, but I would challenge you to maybe create a professional Yahoo or Gmail account, especially if you're somebody who's going to be searching for a full-time job in the near future. And then just like with your voicemail, making sure that you're checking your email regularly. I would say if you are actively applying for jobs, you probably would want to check that email several times a day. So the second section that every resume should include would obviously be your education. You're spending a lot of time and money to get this degree here at Missouri State, so it's really important to make sure that you have your education on your resume. And for most entry-level jobs, That's going to be the first thing that an employer looks for, obviously other than your contact information. So first and foremost, you want to make sure that you'd have an accurate degree title that includes your major and any minors that you have. When including your degree title, it needs to be what's listed on your transcripts. And so it's really important to know whether you have a Bachelor of Arts or a Bachelor's of Science, and then what the actual degree title is that you're pursuing. Again, if you're unsure of what that is, you can always look on your My Missouri State, check your degree audit for that information, or your transcript will also have that listed as well. You want to include the name of your university and the location. So as you notice at the bottom, I have an example there of that. And then your expected graduation date. This is important for employers to see because that gives them an idea of what your current level is in college, whether you're a sophomore, junior, senior, freshman, etc., graduate student. That gives them a better idea of also when you might be available, especially if you're applying for full-time jobs. GPA is one of those things that doesn't always have to be included. I would say that if your GPA is a 3.0 or above, you should include it on your resume. A lot of employers want to see a GPA for internships. Some internships actually have a GPA requirement. If you don't include your GPA and it asks for, or it says that GPA is a requirement for that job, there's a chance that the employer may not consider you because you didn't include all the information they were looking for on your resume. Now, sometimes people may run into a situation where their major GPA is much higher than their cumulative GPA. It's okay to include your major GPA on your resume. You just want to be sure that you include the word major in front of the word GPA, as I'm indicating here. So you don't ever want to try to pass off information or make information look more rosy than it actually is. So you really have to be careful about that. You also don't want to round up your GPA, for example. So the employer may not know that in the initial review and interviewing process, but eventually they're probably going to require your transcripts, and so that information will probably come out in the wash if you've been dishonest with that information on your resume. So it's important to make sure you're putting that accurate information on there. And if you don't know, again, checking your transcripts or your degree audit would be a way to find that. With your education, you could also include your academic honors, so scholarships, awards, dean's lists, those types of achievements that you might have received here at Missouri State. Also, it's important to not include your high school information. So a lot of people will include their diploma on their resume. Really, to get into college, you either have to have a high school diploma or a GED, and so it's pretty much assumed that you have one of those two things if you are attending college here at Missouri State. So all it does is just take up space, and it's not very relevant. Secondly, you would probably only want to include completed degrees on your resume. So what that means is if before coming to Missouri State, you went to a community college and achieved an associate's degree there, then you could probably include that on your resume. But say, for example, you just take a few summer classes at a local community college and you're not pursuing a degree there, you would not include that on your resume. Additionally, with your education, you can also include relevant courses that you've taken, you can include certifications that you've gotten as a result of your education, and you can also include class projects. Now, one thing I would recommend is that if you are planning to include class projects and you want to talk extensively about those, you may want to consider creating a separate section outside of your education to discuss those class projects on your resume. So the third section that every resume should include is obviously your experience. So as I've stated before, experience can be things that weren't necessarily something you were paid to do. So think student organization involvement, volunteerism, and some of the other things that I have listed here. Experience can be very well rounded in terms of as long as you are able to demonstrate skills that are relevant to an employer, it doesn't have to be something you got paid to do. So when it comes to including your experience, there's a few key pieces of information that you want to make sure you include. First would obviously be the title of the job that you held, and then as the location where the company that you worked for, as well as the city and state of where that company or organization is located. You also want to include your dates of employment, including the month. And then if you are no longer working in that role or in that position, you would want to put an end date on that. Now, if you're currently in that role, you can say either present or current as indicated on the example that I have listed here. On average, your experience should be 3 to 6 bullet points per experience. The reason for that being is because you want to avoid a situation where you're not including enough information, but you also don't want to include so much information to where the employer isn't going to want to read it. So on average, 3 to 6 bullet points, 1 to 2 lines per bullet, as you'll see from the example that I have here on the screen. A few things to note when writing your bullet points is to always start with an action verb and ensure that you're using the proper tenses. So what we mean by that is if you're no longer working in a job or performing those duties, you want to use past tense. If you're currently in that job or currently performing those duties, you want to use present tense. In addition, with the content that you're including for each experience that you've had, looking at ways to ensure that you're giving the full scope and perspective of what you did in that position. So one thing you'll notice is that these examples include things like quantifiable information. So you'll see that it discusses 5 full-time professionals here as well as $300,000 down here on this bullet. Why that's important is because when an employer is looking through your document, having that quantifiable information can really stick out to them. It can really give them pause while they're reading your document to make them want to look at your document even more closely, which is what you want. The more time an employer spends looking at your document, the higher your chances are of potentially getting an interview, which is the purpose of the resume. So in the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more about how you can write those effective bullet points or accomplishment statements on your resume. But this example here is a really good foundation to help you better understand effective ways to communicate the skills and experiences that you have had in any type of experience or role that you've been involved with. So when it comes to writing strong accomplishment statements or those strong bullet point statements, as I've mentioned previously, tailoring your resume is key. Employers are looking for those keywords and those relevant pieces of information. So as I mentioned previously, using those job descriptions to help guide you about what you should include and how you should include it is vital. So for example, if you're looking at a job posting and an employer mentions the ability to work in teams several times, it should be a very good indication to you that they're looking for somebody who knows how to collaborate with others. And so with that being said, that's an indicator to you that you should be including experiences you've had working in teams or working with others on your resume or in your cover letter or in both places. And so using those job descriptions as your guide can be very, very helpful in making sure that you increase your chances of being considered for an interview. Another reason why using keywords and relevant information is important is because a lot of employers, especially larger organizations, will use a system called an applicant tracking system. And so essentially what those systems are designed to do is to skim your resume and your cover letters to determine how many keywords and relevant pieces of information do you have in your document. And oftentimes, if you don't hit a certain percentage of keywords and relevant pieces of information, the computer is going to boot you out of the system before you even have the chance to make it to a human for consideration. And so again, it doesn't mean that you have to start over and trash your resume and create a new one every single time you apply for a job, but you do want to make sure that you're comparing what you're submitting for a job to that job posting to ensure that you really increase your chances of securing an interview for that position. And again, thinking about those transferable skills that you have, like I mentioned before, employers care greatly about these transferable skills, like some of the ones I have mentioned here. And so those are going to be very common items that you'll want to make sure you incorporate and bring into your documentation. So as I mentioned, those 3 sections are obviously the ones that you want to make sure you include no matter what your major or career path is. These additional sections are just some examples of ones that you may consider including. Now, these are going to vary depending on the individual. So one individual might have a leadership experience section on their resume and another one may not. It really just depends on you and your own personal background and experiences. There's also some outside of this list that you may consider using as well. This is not all inclusive, just an example of some that you might consider for your documentation. One that you'll notice on here is objective statement. And you'll see these in a lot of examples from previous years. They're not really as useful as they once were. Typically, objective statements can be beneficial for certain circumstances. So for example, if you, like I mentioned before, are applying for a job in a city that maybe you don't have residency in, having an objective statement on your resume may be helpful to explain to an employer why you're applying for a job in that city. So for example, you may want to include a short objective statement, saying that planning to relocate to Dallas, Texas and looking for jobs or careers in X industry. That gives the employer indication that you are willing to relocate and that you're planning to come out to wherever that metropolitan area is, even though you might be attending school or living currently in Springfield, Missouri. So to help, ensuring that you're communicating your experiences the best way possible to employers, it's important to really look at your bullet points and ask yourself, are they communicating everything that I want an employer to know about me? Or are they maybe too vague? So you'll see some examples on here of some vague bullet point statements that are not typically effective and are not typically going to pique the interest of an employer. So from this slide here, you can see things like answering and directing telephone calls, assisting a teacher with lecture, managing a cash drawer. Those are all things that to an employer aren't going to seem very notable. So what you have to do is ask yourself, why are these bullet points or these statements that I've chosen to include on here important, and what skills am I trying to promote by including these on here? And so really looking at that critically and thinking, is there a better way that I can describe what I did in this position? So an example that we'll look at here is answering and directing telephone calls. Now, when you look at this statement down here and thinking about what type of skill sets it presents to an employer that you might possess, it really gives the employer a better sense of, if they hire you or they consider you for a position with their organization, what are you going to be able to contribute or what are you going to bring to the table? And so when you talk about things like operate a multi-line telephone in a central office to ensure questions and concerns are addressed in a timely manner, what you're now showing an employer is your communication skills, because anybody can answer and direct a telephone call, right? But here, by kind of just including some more relevant details, you are showing them that you can problem solve. You can get calls to where they need to go, that you have excellent communication skills, and that you have an understanding of the job that you're currently performing. And so rather than saying answering and directing telephone calls, you've now just demonstrated several skills to an employer that you possess. And so I'm not going to go through this line by line, but this is just a way for you to start thinking more critically to some of the bullet points or some of the pieces of information that you might consider putting in your resume. I always like to use this formula called the problem action results formula. What this does is it helps you to think a little bit more outside the box of the content that you're wanting to include. And so just like with the grid that we talked about earlier, this is something that I would highly encourage anybody who's putting your resume together to do. And think about your bullet points and your experiences and what you did in that previous role, that job, that student organization, whatever it is that you're talking about, and how do some of these things play out. So what were some of the problems that you faced or the challenges that you performed in that job? What are some of the actions that you took to solve those problems? And what were some of the results? What did you contribute? What did you bring to the table? How did you help the employer or the student organization or the volunteer organization that you were working for? How did you contribute to all those? And then asking yourself some of these questions here. Why was it relevant? What purpose did it serve? Does my bullet point fully demonstrate the scope of my responsibilities? And then, as I mentioned before, is any of it quantifiable? Can I include numbers, dollar signs, percentages, numbers that kind of help to tell my story a little bit better, to show an employer exactly what I'm capable of if I were hired for a potential position they're interviewing for? So these are just some additional examples to kind of give you a better perspective on more effective ways to write out some of your bullet point statements from some of the previous from the previous list that I showed you before. And so, again, thinking a little bit outside the box, including that quantifiable pieces of information and those details. Now, I know I said before that it should be 1 to 2 lines. It obviously looks a little bit longer on the slideshow, but if you were to put this on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, it would be about 2 lines. And so again, you want to really stick with that 1 to 2 lines, so that way you're not putting too much information, making it turn more into paragraphs as opposed to easily identifiable pieces of information on your document. So again, just a few examples. So a few additional things that you'd want to avoid when putting your resume together is, like I've mentioned before, misrepresenting information. A second one would be not using unknown acronyms. And so this can be really important, especially if you're wanting to include things about like an organization that you're involved with. Just remember that if somebody outside of the organization wouldn't understand what that acronym means, then it's probably a good idea for you to spell it out. I mentioned action verbs already. It's really important to make sure that you're using those action verbs appropriately and using the appropriate tenses for those. Spell check is a big one. And although I love Microsoft Word, sometimes simply relying on that program to spell check your document can actually get you in some trouble when it comes to your grammar and spelling mistakes. As we know, sometimes Microsoft Word does miss things, or it takes a word that is spelled correctly when you actually meant to say another word. And we know that's probably happened to all of us at some point in time. So my advice is not to just rely on Microsoft Word to solely spell check your document. Have a friend or somebody that you know or somebody that you trust that's going to give you some honest feedback, like the Career Center. Look at that document for you before you apply for a job. But very vital. Spell checking might seem like a minor thing, but again, if you're applying to a job where there's 100 other applicants, spelling and grammatical errors are things that employers will immediately notice and will often take you out of the running for that opportunity. Having an inaccessible format, I've mentioned a few things about font and font sizes. Another aspect when it comes to your format is thinking about how you are presenting that through a digital means. So what I mean is like emailing your resume or uploading it to an online platform. A lot of times when you simply use just a Microsoft Word document, as you might be familiar with, the formatting can get messed up a little bit. Maybe the font style you use doesn't translate to another person's computer. And so one thing you'll want to consider is making sure that you save your document and use PDF format. PDF format usually does not change, and so anytime you're communicating with somebody electronically and you're wanting to share your resume, whether it's online or through email, using that PDF format can be very helpful in those circumstances. I've already mentioned a little bit about avoiding paragraphs, not making your bullets too long. Another aspect you'd want to avoid is including references. So a lot of times people will throw some references down at the bottom of their resume. Those are not necessary on your resume. References should be reserved for a separate sheet of paper, or usually an employer will ask you to include those in an online application that you might be applying to. And so references really just take up space. And honestly, I usually encourage students to even remove that statement that a lot of people like to include that says references available upon request. That's really just taking up space. References are going to be usually a given to include when it comes to applying for a job online. And then finally, you want to make sure that you don't include demographic information. So this is things related to your age, your race, your gender. Those are all protected pieces of information that an employer is not allowed to use when making hiring considerations. And so you don't want to include that information on your resume. That would also include things like your social security, your birth date. And then also you don't want to include your picture, because oftentimes an employer doesn't need that information to help them need that picture to help them in making a decision about who to interview. And so typically you wouldn't want to include your picture on your resume either. So obviously there are a lot of other aspects about writing resumes and a lot of things that we weren't able to cover today. But I do want to let you know that we in the Career Center are here to help you with any of your career development needs that you might have, including resumes and cover letters. So if you have any specific questions that weren't answered through this presentation, as a student or an alumni of Missouri State University, you are more than welcome to use our services to assist you with creating those documents. We will help you if you have something that, just on a sheet of paper and you're not really sure where to go from, or if you've never even done a resume before, we will help you with that whole process. Here we have a few other services that we provide to students. We can help you in career preparation, whether that is practicing your interviewing skills, searching for a job or an internship, writing any type of professional letters, creating a LinkedIn profile, or even preparing for graduate school. We also offer several services for career and major exploration. So if you're somebody who's not really sure what you want to do, or you're just trying to explore different careers or majors that you might be interested in, we offer several services related to that in our office. We can provide free career assessments. We also have a few 4-credit career exploration courses called IDS 120. And then we also will sit down with you in a one-on-one meeting just to talk about any questions that you might have about careers, majors, how to achieve certain career goals that you might have, anything that might fall under that category. If you're interested in getting assistance from the Career Center, you can obviously contact us through various mediums. You can contact us by phone, via email, or you can log into your Handshake account where you can make an appointment with a staff member in our office. Or you're also welcome to stop by one of our 2 locations in Glass Hall 276 or Carrington Hall 309. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation today. I've included my personal contact information in case you have any questions about this presentation. I'll be more than happy to assist you. You can contact me via phone or email listed below. Thank you and have a great day.